Our Citizens Read book this month is entitled Midnight at the Dragon Cafe. It will be held on Monday, February 26th. And finally, our Friday forum for next week will be legislative update with Senator Peter Courtney and Representative Jeff Merkley. They'll be discussing priorities, predictions, and challenges for the legislative session, so I hope you'll all be able to be there. The details about this program can be found in your bulletin on the website, pdxcityclub.org, and at the back table. We have 8 new members today, and I'd like to introduce them. I'd like them to stand, and when they've all stood, please recognize and welcome them to City Club. First, we have a young member, Max Wendell, son of Peter Wendell, right down here in front. You can also stand up, Peter. I think you were never recognized when you joined. All right. Jan Kitchell, who also represented a Guantanamo detainee, who's right here. Criminal defense attorneys Janet Hoffman and Carrie Menikoff. Over here, Barbara Wolf, Stephen Sherlag, Diane Foreman, and Jeffrey Drummond. Would you please welcome them all to City Club? Portland is so fortunate to have great corporate citizens who also believe in and invest in civic engagement and know that it's an important part of life here in Portland. Our corporate sponsors this quarter are Girding Eadlin Development Company and McEwen Giswold LLP. Would you please join me in thanking our sponsors? Our program today, I think, has something for everyone. There's a little legal and constitutional history, some human drama, and some travelogue. Our speaker today is Steve Wax, Oregon's federal public defender. He has been for 23 years. Steve will be talking with us about representing 7 Guantanamo Bay detainees who have been imprisoned there for about the last 5 years. Steve is the son of immigrant parents, raised in Brooklyn, went to Harvard Law School. He learned early in life, hearing stories about grandparents and great-grandparents, that government power, unchecked, can be oppressive. Stephen also learned as a 6th grader when he watched his sister perform as Anne Frank in a school play that in spite of it all, people are basically good, and that there is a core of humanity that resides in each of us. Steve's work, first as a prosecutor in Brooklyn and now as a public defender, represents his fundamental belief in the rule of law, that the rule of law is jeopardized by both individuals and by government, that the rule of law keeps us free. But Steve's interests don't stop with the rule of law. No, there's much more to this versatile guy, and I'll tell you just a little bit more. Steve took up tap dancing. Yes, I did say tap dancing at age 53. He's performed now for about 4 years, most recently at holiday parties. So now what is this all about? Well, he says that it holds the perfect combination of movement and noise. So please welcome, with movement and noise, federal public defender and citizen, Steve Wax.
Well, thank you, Susan. Fortunately, the podium will hide my feet. It's an honor to be invited back here. 3 years ago, I had the privilege of speaking to this organization about my representation of Portland attorney Brandon Mayfield when he was mistakenly connected to the train bombings in Madrid. Today I'm going to speak to you about representation of some more innocent men, men whose lives have been devastated by the war on terror. And this time it's about men who are imprisoned in Guantanamo Bay, Cuba. A little less than a year ago, on March 4, 2006, I stepped up to the counter at Lynx Air, small commuter airline in the Fort Lauderdale airport. And I presented my country and theater clearances, documents that had been provided by the Department of Defense that gave me access to the U.S. Naval Base in Guantanamo Bay. 3 hours later, I stepped off the two-seater, needle-nose, quite noisy plane onto the tarmac at the base. With me were some colleagues from my office, Chris Schatz and Brian Leslie, assistant defenders who were going there to see one of our other clients, an Afghan named Mr. Shaman. And with me to see Adil Hamad, a person I'll be speaking quite a bit about today, was one of my assistants, Pat Ehlers. We were met at the airport by our military escort, who told us that while we would be free to roam on the leeward side of the island where we were going to be staying, when we came across the next day to the windward side where the prison is, our movement would be restricted and we would be escorted by military personnel at all times. Woke up the following morning and got on the 7:40 a.m. bus that pulled up in front of the CBQ, or Combined Bachelor Quarters, a sort of hotel where we were staying. Painted white, a rickety old school bus driven by a Jamaican contract worker. When I asked, he said he was earning $2.49 an hour. Drove us down to the ferry terminal on the leeward side, where we got onto a ship that looked like a Navy ship, but was being run by Filipino contract workers under contract with our Navy. Crossed the bay, beautiful blue water, beautiful blue sky, pulled into the harbor on the windward side. Greeted there by a rusting hulk, the desalination plant that has provided all the water for the base since 1964, when Fidel Castro, in a fit of pique, cut the pipeline that had been bringing water to the base. Greeted by the military escorts, we got on the small bus, stopped to have pictures taken and get badges, and then drove through the base. And on the one hand, we could have been in anywhere USA where there is a base. There was a McDonald's, there was a Subway, there was even a Starbucks, although it was an ersatz Starbucks without any scones or muffins, but the coffee, they insisted, was the real thing. Driving down Kittery Beach Road, past little subdivisions with names like Iguana Terrace and Sunrise Place, heading toward a prison, heading toward the prison in Guantanamo Bay, where our government has held people without charge, without trial, and without access to any court for now up to 5 years. Coming down the road toward the prison, looking out at the beautiful Caribbean, we're stopped at the checkpoint. And yes, this is a military checkpoint with men standing there, women standing there with M16s. One fellow got on the bus, sidearm at his side, the top of his holster unsnapped, hand on his gun, to check the badges of the half-dozen lawyers and interpreters who were on the bus. A couple hundred yards on our right, we saw the fencing of what is called Camp Delta, which is one of the largest of the units of this prison, where more than 140 men, including Mr. Hamad, who I was going to see, are housed. The fence, of course, was covered with an opaque screen. So these men in their prison, several hundred yards from the Caribbean, could never see the water. Around to Camp Echo, through the security screening there, and on into the interior of the compound, where there were approximately 8, maybe 20 by 20 wooden buildings that were used for visitation and also house some men who just can't be housed with the other people who were there. Freshly laid concrete paths, and we walked, Pat and I to the left, Chris and Brian to the right, to see our respective clients in the different units. We're very careful to stay on the concrete because we have been told that the wonderful gravel in between was actually filled with landmines in case any of the guys decided that they were going to make a run for it. Now, I don't know if that's true or not, but I can assure you that we didn't test the gravel. Came up to cell number 12. The door opened. I looked in. And to the left is a wire mesh. On the other side of the wire mesh was a metal plank, a bed, a metal toilet, a towel, and nothing else. Seated directly in front, behind a small table, chained to the floor, an eye hook in the floor, chains around his legs, chained down, was a handsome, burly, dark-skinned, short-cropped hair, short-cropped beard man, wearing a white shirt and white pants. A man I have come to know over the past year as a caring and happy human being, notwithstanding what our government has been doing to him. His name is Adil Hamad, and he is one of my 7 clients. Over the next half hour, I'm going to talk to you a little bit more about Mr. Hamad. Who is he? How did he end up in Guantanamo? And how did I, as the federal public defender for Oregon, end up representing alleged terrorists in Cuba? What have I been trying to do for Mr. Hamad? And what has our government been doing to obstruct those efforts? And then try to sum it up by talking a little bit about why this fight is so important. Well, Adil Hamad, who is he? He grew up in the Port Sudan area of Sudan. His father was a physician's assistant. And as a boy, Adil would go out with his dad, sometimes in a car, sometimes on muleback, to some of the small villages in the area, where his dad, the assistant, was the only medical person that many of those people ever got to see. As Adil said to me one day, chained to the floor in the prison, my parents sowed the seeds of mercy in me. Adil graduated from a college in Egypt, got a job doing air conditioning work in Sudan, but it wasn't what he wanted to do with his life. And as is true of many Arabs from the poorer Arab countries, Adil was able to find a job outside of his country, working with one of the oil-rich countries, in this instance, a charity that was sponsored by the Kuwaiti government, a charity that has branches in many countries and hundreds of employees around the world. The job that Adil got was to work with this charity in Pakistan, working with refugees of the then ongoing Soviet-Afghan wars. Now remember that in the 1980s, the Soviet Union was bogged down in a war in Afghanistan similar to the experience we had in Vietnam. Lots of refugees crossing over into Pakistan, and many non-governmental organizations in the Arab world were providing assistance to the refugees, as was our government, as our government was funding the Mujahideen who were fighting the Soviets. Mujahideen, some of whom later ended up as our enemies in Al-Qaeda, in the Taliban. But at that time, they were our friends. Everything that Adil did in Pakistan and in Afghanistan was legal. Passports, visas, work permits, etc. The contract that he had with the charity gave him a month leave each year to go back to his home, and the first year back home, he met and married Selwa Othman. She went back to Pakistan with him, and over the course of the 17 years that he spent working in Pakistan and Afghanistan, they had 5 daughters. After 6 years teaching in an orphanage, delivering food to refugee camps, Adil was promoted to administrative positions and continued working with this charity until 1999, when the funding for that charity dried up. After a few months doing some import-export work, he was fortunate enough to land a job with another charity, this time one funded by the Saudis. It's called the World Assembly of Muslim Youth. It has more than 2,000 employees in more than 50 countries. And Adil's job was to be the administrator of a hospital that WAMI ran in Chamkani, Afghanistan, an area that in 2000 when the Taliban were still in control in Afghanistan, was outside the main sphere of influence of Taliban control. And some of the doctors he worked with were actually exiles who had fled the Taliban, fled Kabul, been in exile in Pakistan, and then gone back across. Completely non-political, great hospital. Then came the attacks of September 11, 2001. And the Afghan government told all non-Afghani workers for charitable organizations, we can't protect you, you better get out. And Adil did. But he was the last of the non-Afghanis to leave the hospital. He stayed as long as he could, and then the hospital was kind enough to put him in the ambulance and drive him up to through the Khyber Pass, through the Torkham Gate, storied routes of Alexander, on back into Pakistan, where he spent the next year working in administration for WAMI, based in Peshawar, Pakistan. June 2002, the family went back home for its annual vacation, and unfortunately, on that trip, his wife's father died. And they made the decision that she would need to stay and that she and the girls would not go back to Pakistan with him. So he went back, and he went back to work. Now, up to this point, I ask, we've heard about an African, a black man who is an Arab, and a Muslim. But the story, the reaction that I had to this story as he was telling it to me was, this is familiar, this is what I know from America. A family that believes in education, compassion, hard work, trying to find a better life. And I'm wondering if it struck you, any of you, in the same way. But it's at this point when Adil went back to work that his life took a terrible turn. It took a turn that, as with Brandon Mayfield, involved getting thrown into a prison by the United States government. But unlike Brandon, he's still in prison. Unlike Brandon, he's never had the opportunity to have a day in court. And unlike Brandon, even though the fingerprint that was put out there as the link between him and the Spanish bombing attack, there is not even one shred of evidence that I can prove is mistaken, as you'll hear later on. July 14, 2002. Picture yourself as Selwa Othman. She didn't take her husband's last name, as is the culture there. Says goodbye to her husband in Khartoum. And he then disappeared from her life. He didn't call when he got back to Peshawar, as she expected. He didn't call the next day or for 7 months after that. And all of her inquiries to her government and to the headquarters of the charity WAMI were for naught. No one could tell her a thing about him. He just disappeared from her life. It wasn't until March of 2003 when our government was putting a bag over Adil's head and taking him out of the U.S. military prison in Bagram, Afghanistan, to fly him to Guantanamo. At that same time, a letter finally arrived in Khartoum through the International Red Cross telling Selwa where her husband was. Well, what had happened to him? He went back home, he went to work, he went home that night, and suddenly at 1:30 in the morning found teams of Pakistani security police coming over the walls of the house and seizing him. He gave them his passport, he gave them his work permit, he gave them the explanation that I've given you of what he had done during the past 17 years. And the blonde American, as he describes it, who was with the Pakistanis, said, "Take him anyway." He was put in a prison in Pakistan for 6 months, which was unpleasant to say the least, where he lost 70 pounds, before the Pakistanis transferred him to the U.S. at Bagram. In Bagram, when he got there, out of the plane, thrown down on the tarmac, and he said he'd never been beaten by the Pakistanis, but thrown down by the Americans on the tarmac, kicked, His clothes were cut off, jerked up naked, but still with a bag over his head, and taken inside, given coarse clothing, put in a cell, and told to stand for 3 days. Stand and not sleep. One of the techniques of interrogation that our government was using. After that 3-day period, the interrogations began. Constant, back and forth over 2 weeks, until Otto, weakened by having lost 70 pounds, collapsed. And fortunately, the military then took him to the hospital at Bagram. And he is fortunate that he survived, because you can go to the New York Times archive and read articles from that time about the deaths of prisoners in Bagram. Otto told his interrogators there what I've told you, which is what he told me. And what did they do? Nothing. No investigation, nothing. Interrogate and interrogate. And then they took him to Guantanamo, where the interrogations continued. And what did he do? He told them the same thing. And what did they do? Nothing. No effort to call WAMI, no effort to call the first employer, no effort to contact anyone in the government in Pakistan or Afghanistan or the United Nations or World Food Program or the World Health Organization, organizations with whom Otto had been in constant contact. He's never been accused of being a terrorist. He's never been accused of being a fighter. He's never been accused of being on a battlefield or doing anything against the United States, yet he sits in Guantanamo. Well, let me turn away from him for a moment and talk about Guantanamo a little bit more generally. Is Otto's case unique, or is he somewhere within the bell curve of the lives of the prisoners who are there? The first prisoners were taken to Guantanamo Bay in January of 2002. Then Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld said that is the least worst place to hold them. Interesting term. Why? It's isolated. It's great. No pickets, no protests, no visitors, no media, total military control. And who did the then Secretary of Defense say was being brought there? And what has been repeated by the President, the Vice President, and others in the government for the last 6 years or 5 years? They're the worst of the worst. They're all fighters. They were all picked up on a battlefield. Every last one of them wouldn't blink an eye before murdering your mother in her bed. That's what our government says. Look it up online. It's all there. What is the reality? Well, I represent 7 clients. And of the 7 clients with whom I've interacted, only one even attempted to get onto a battlefield. Only one. One was arrested in a Taliban prison where he had been tortured by the Taliban, who believed that he was a U.S. and American spy for 18 months. One was arrested in a house after he had just been to a doctor, and we have sworn statements from that doctor, and on and on. So are my clients representative, or are they unique? Well, the United States Department of Defense has put out on the internet reports on roughly 517 of the men who have been detained in Guantanamo. And a professor at Seton Hall Law School in New York with a group of students has analyzed that data, the government's own data, not one shred from a defense attorney. So you can't say it's suspect, or perhaps you should say it's suspect because it came from the Department of Defense, but we don't need to go there. And what did they say? They said that from studying the Department of Defense's own data, fewer than 5% of the men in Guantanamo were actually caught by the United States. The rest were turned over to us by Pakistani and Afghan authorities. Fewer than 8% by the Department of Defense's own data were al-Qaeda fighters. And fewer than 50% were ever accused of committing any hostile act. Fewer than 50%. Bounty signs, bounties were paid by our government, $5,000 apiece, to Afghan and Pakistani people to turn in suspects. Okay, so I'm a lawyer. What am I doing in these cases? And how does that all come about? Well, shortly after the first prisoners were brought there, two of them, British citizens, one whose name is Rasool, for the lawyers in the audience, there is a case bearing his name now from the U.S. Supreme Court, filed petitions for writs of habeas corpus with the United States District Court in Washington, D.C. Habeas corpus, an ancient writ, comes to us from the British, from the time of Magna Carta. It's 800 years old, been described as the most powerful tool for keeping executive power in check, divined in the Anglo-American world, used to rein in the power of kings. A writ that says to a court, bring the body forward, and that says to the king or the president, you have to justify why this man is going to be held in prison. They filed writs. The lawyers who represented them came from what's known, it's a private nonprofit in New York City called the Center for Constitutional Rights. And later, other detainees had lawyers from big firms like Jan, who was introduced earlier, who volunteered their time to represent some of the detainees. What was the government's response to these petitions? The response was to say, federal judges, you have no power. We have these men in Guantanamo, and you have no jurisdiction there. They also said, and by the way, the Geneva Conventions, which are supposed to govern treatment of prisoners of war, don't apply to these men because they're not prisoners of war. We call them enemy combatants, a term that the government had not yet even defined. Legal battles reigned for 2 years. Enter the fray a fellow named Fred Korematsu. Again, his name will be familiar to the lawyers here. A Japanese American who was interned, that is, imprisoned by our government during World War II, during the wholesale internment of 112,000 Japanese Americans. Fred Korematsu, still alive, still believing in the injustice that was perpetrated on him, filed an amicus brief, a friend of the court brief with the Supreme Court. The essence of it was, shame. Don't repeat that historic mistake. And in June of 2004, the U.S. Supreme Court issued a decision in this Rasool case rebuking the Bush administration, saying to the Bush administration, there is jurisdiction, these men have rights. As a result, notices were sent to Guantanamo, and a fair number of men who did not know about the litigation that had been started by Rasool filed habeas petitions. District Court in Washington, D.C. turned to my counterpart. First he turned to CCR and said, guys, can you help out? And the pro bono well at that point was dry. Then they turned to my counterpart, federal defender in Washington, and said, AJ, can you take on 51 cases we just got in? AJ said, maybe 3. A call went out to the federal defender offices around the country. Would anyone else step up? And I volunteered the office. I volunteered the office to take on these cases in addition to the normal work we do. And when I volunteered the office, I did not know if I would end up representing terrorists, Al-Qaeda fighters, if I would end up representing the men as described by the President, the Vice President, and the Secretary of Defense, the worst of the worst, or if I would end up representing someone like Brandon, an innocent man wrongly caught up in something. And it didn't matter to me, and I have to say that. It didn't matter to me for the following reason. As Susan said in the introduction, because it's the rule of law that keeps us all free. And there's a quote from a play, A Man for All Seasons, Robert Bolt, about Sir Thomas More and his battle with the old King Henry about divorce and the church, where More says this, you must give the devil himself the benefit of the law, because where would you hide, Roper? when all the laws are mown down and the devil turns around on you. So, terrorists or innocent men, to me it was irrelevant. What is important is give them process. It is the rule of law that we must protect above all else. So, just after we get into the cases, the Bush administration strikes an agreement with Congress and has Congress pass a law to undo what the Supreme Court had said about jurisdiction. And at the end of 2005, the Detainee Treatment Act was passed, purporting to strip the federal courts of jurisdiction to hear any case from Guantanamo. Well, as a criminal defense attorney, you can't take anything as a signal to stop. You just keep going. You know, adversity is the name of the game. Congress says no jurisdiction. I say, we're going to find jurisdiction. So we kept on. And we filed some pleadings, and the court in our case, one of the few, actually ordered the government to respond to us in some way. And they gave us some papers on Mr. Hamad. Legal term, it's called a return. Here, this is why we are detaining him. And those papers said, we're detaining Mr. Hamad, Adil Hamad, because he worked for this charity, LDI. He worked for this charity, WAMI. And some people in those organizations have at some times said some anti-American things. I kid you not. Go to my office's website and you can get all the documentation, including the government material. http://or.fd.org. It's all there, black and white. So I also got, along with that, classified material. Uh-oh. I have to go to what's called the secure facility in Washington, D.C. to read the secret stuff. Now, I must say that having read the unsecret stuff and said, this is impossible, this is not America, I was a little bit concerned when I went to the secure facility. Now, because of the protective orders, and this is classified, I cannot tell you what I read. But I can tell you this. In the proceeding against Adil Hamad, that was eventually held 3 years after his arrest to determine whether he should stay in prison. Proceeding where there are no lawyers, no rules of evidence, he's not allowed to even see the evidence. There was a dissenter from the decision to hold him, a U.S. Army major. And that U.S. Army major said, this is unconscionable, that's his word, not mine, to detain this man. Everything that you have presented against him, he said, is guilt by association. And in his dissent, they unclassified, to my good fortune, the following phrase: my decision is based on full review of the unclassified and classified material. So I can tell you that a U.S. Army major read it all, and he said it was unconscionable. I can also tell you that I've been practicing law for more than 30 years. I'm a prudent lawyer, and I, as a general proposition, do not take positions when I am aware of evidence that could end up harming my client. Okay, so what else do we do here for him with this? I still don't want to take at face value what he said or what the major said. We investigate. And I sent teams from the office to Afghanistan and Pakistan, investigators to go out and try to find the people that my client had been talking about. And we obtained approximately 10 sworn statements, videotaped, hours of videotape of men saying that this is a non-political, wonderful, caring human being who worked as a hospital administrator and charity worker. We spoke with the deputy minister of the Afghan government. We spoke with the head of the charity in Pakistan. We spoke with the director of the hospital. Then what happens? As Things are winding forward. Another case gets to the Supreme Court in June of '06. A fellow named Hamdan, not Hamad, Hamdan. And the Supreme Court the government says to the Supreme Court again, well, we heard you 2 years ago, but we didn't believe you. We still say there's no jurisdiction and there are no rights. And for the second time in June of '06, in the Hamdan case, the Supreme Court rebukes the Bush administration and says, we meant what we said. We are a nation of laws and rules. These men do have a right to file, and we will hear their claims. So 3 months later, the Bush administration goes back to Congress and passes the Military Commissions Act of 2006, which again purports to strip jurisdiction from the federal courts. Now, the debate over the MCA was a debate that I submit involves one of the most critical issues of our entire history, because it involves the question of whether the executive branch in this country has the power to define by itself what is going to be considered an imprisonable act, to seize a person without any judicial intervention, to then hold the person without showing him any evidence, and to prevent a federal court from reviewing what he has done. Now, I do recall from some of my college history classes discussions about the divine right of kings. And I don't think I'm overstating it when I say the battle that is being joined in the courts on these cases is that fundamental to the structure of our government and the freedoms that we have all enjoyed. Now, you don't need to know my politics and what party affiliation, if any, I have. But I'm going to quote to you from a Republican and a Democrat, both from Oregon, because we were quite fortunate in those debates to have Senator Smith and Congressman Wu, two of the most outspoken of the members of Congress on this issue, both of whom identified the fundamental battle that is being waged in the Congress and in the courts right now. This old writ of habeas corpus, the power of the judiciary to say to the executive, if you want to hold someone, you need to do that in the light of day. You need to do it in a way that enables other people outside of yourself to look at what you're doing. That's what the writ is all about. Now, you might say, but these are just guys, furners down in Guantanamo. Not so. When I represented Brandon, I had to tell him that he might not be present in the Multnomah County Jail after my first meeting with him, because it was only 2 weeks before his arrest that the first arguments on this issue were made in the Rasul case, where the Attorney General had said, we have this unlimited power. And notwithstanding the Supreme Court's decisions, U.S. citizen Jose Padilla was held for more than 3 years in a Navy brig in South Carolina without charge. And when he was finally indicted last year, the dirty radioactive bomb business, which had been trumpeted in the newspapers, was nowhere to be seen in the indictment. And there is a legal resident alien, a Mr. Almari, still in a Navy brig, a fellow who is in this country legally, picked up under the same circumstances. So the issue is domestic as well as foreign. All right. I'm going to stop at this point with a remembrance from the Reverend Martin Luther King that is so wonderfully engraved on the Multnomah County Justice Center downtown. The letter from the Birmingham City Jail, April 16, 1963, Dr. King said, "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere." And that is why I speak to you with such passion about this subject. Thanks for listening.
Thank you very much, Steve. Privilege of membership in City Club is to ask questions of our guest. We'd ask, of course, that your questions be brief, that they be questions and not speeches, so that several people will have a chance to ask Steve a question. Our first question will be asked by board host Don Williams. Don is president-elect of City Club. He's a member of the Board of Governors. He is chief operating officer for Schwalbe, Williamson, and Wyatt. Don.
Thank you, Steve. I hope we have you back before 3 more years elapses. Perhaps one of the problems manifested at Guantanamo Bay is that the nature of war has changed so dramatically. It's not easy anymore to simply identify who is a soldier and who is a spy. One law school professor wrote recently, "The Geneva Conventions are not obsolete. They protect innocent civilians by restricting the use of violence to enemy combatants. They give soldiers protections for obeying the rules of war." He goes on to say, however, that the Geneva Conventions make sense when the war involves nation states. Multinational terrorist groups and pseudo-states pose a deep threat to treaty-based warfare. He contends that if we fight these kind of enemies, we must have a new set of rules. Do you agree with this assertion, and do we need a modern instrument to replace what was created in 1940?
It's a great question, and it gets to one of the other fundamental issues that we're dealing with here. Is this a war that we're engaged in, or is this a matter that should be handled within the military justice system or the criminal justice system? There have been scholars and politicians debating that issue for the last several years. I don't think that it's necessary to answer that question and to say that the Geneva Conventions as a whole fit all situations or that we need to modify them in some way. What I think is fundamental is that whatever it is we do, there needs to be openness and process. And what unfortunately has happened is that there has been no openness, and the process that was created was straight out of Kafka. And that's the troubling thing. I think that it is troubling on a number of levels, but the one that I'm going to mention right now is the level of self-interest. And that is what the United States does, for better or worse, becomes the model for the world. And if we don't set the bar high in terms of fair treatment of people we don't like, then I think that we open our soldiers and citizens traveling on business who might be suspected of being CIA agents to similar treatment. So whether you agree on a moral basis or a political basis or not, I think that there is a self-interested basis for saying that we need to have a system that has fair process for people who we seize and imprison, whether they're wearing a uniform or not, members of a nation state or not. That's how I try to answer it.
Paul Milius, City Club member. Thank you, Steve, for personifying the situation that many of us, I'm sure, know and abhor in Guantanamo and the other places where people have been held. And I'm going to have to choke back my own outrage. So I'm going to ask a very civil question. What do we, as citizens and activists, us liberals with good table manners, do to upset this imperial view of the rights of man?
I guess I would say, if you agreed with some of the message that I was conveying, reconvey it, spread the word, pass it forward. I think that one of the very subtly pernicious things that happened by the selection of Guantanamo as the place to house the men was that it has lulled a lot of people. There hasn't been as much debate. There hasn't been as much discussion. And when all that is put out there is the statements from the administration, the worst of the worst, I mean, we do tend to believe what our government officials tell us. And it's one of the reasons why I have been trying to put a human face on the men. And I try not to call them the detainees. I represent Adil Hamad. I represent Shaman Gul. I represent Amur Mamar, people with wives and children. So speak. And of course, the First Amendment says you have the right to petition your government for redress of grievances. Let Senator Smith, let Senator Wyden, let Congressman Wu, Blumenauer, whoever your representative is, let them know how you feel. Applaud them for the votes that some of them took, and urge them to take, well, gee, am I crossing the line in terms of what I can say as a federal employee? I'll stop the sentence. Next question.
Paul Meyer, member of the club. Steve, semantics plays a significant role in this issue. We've typically had war against a particular country or group of countries. Even the concept of a war on terrorists would have at least some context of being against somebody. But this has been termed in semantically a war on terror. And that is, of course, a war against an idea, a concept, and obviously it's something that's going to be perpetual. We're always going to have the possibility of terror in one form or another. Would you comment upon how we can change the dynamic of the semantics of what we're dealing with here so that we can focus more on what you've been talking about?
Well, I think you've articulated that very well. And it's interesting if you read the oral argument in the Rasool case, that one of the justices asked the Solicitor General, are you telling us that we can detain these men indefinitely? Is this a war without end? And the answer was, well, my opinion is it wasn't terribly straightforward and didn't shed a lot of light on it. The solicitor danced around the issue because the point is precisely what you've made. This is a war without end. There's a science fiction book called The Forever War by a fellow named Haldeman. And you declare a war, you declare something a war that doesn't end. We need to be changing the words we use, again, to remind ourselves and everyone else, these are individual human beings who are being imprisoned. You know, detainees, gee, that's a benign word. What's a detainee? Oh, we're just detaining you, holding you for a short time. They're in prison. This is a prison. They are prisoners. And whether they're called prisoners of war or not, they are prisoners of war, whether it fits the Geneva Convention or not. We need to in our words, change the dialogue. I'm not sure what else I can offer.
Sharon Padgett, City Club member. Steve, what happens next specifically with your clients? What do you see happening?
I wish I had a crystal ball. What happens next is that we will continue the fight in the courtroom. We will continue the fight in the court of public opinion, which I guess is part of what this appearance here today is about as far as my clients are concerned. I've filed briefs in the U.S. Supreme Court and in the Court of Appeals on the legal issues. Even though my clients aren't at the head of the line on these cases, we've put our 2 cents in. We continue to file pleadings in the district court saying to the judges, in very polite legalese, for God's sake, Judge, wake up and do the right thing. And while I cannot, as a federal employee, lobby, when I'm invited by Congress people to provide input and educate them about what's going on, I do that, and I have done that. So we're just going to keep on fighting. Senator Dodd from Connecticut has introduced a bill to repeal the repeal of habeas corpus, and anyone who is so inclined to remember the First Amendment, I'm not lobbying, but you got a First Amendment right to tell people that you like what Dodd has done if you believe that's right. And that's what we have to do. You know, we as citizens of this country must speak up in whatever way we can. That's what our democracy is about. We've got to exercise it.
Jack Beatty, City Club member. What consideration has been given in the general discussion of the handling of these prisoners to the constitutional provision prohibiting cruel and inhuman punishment? That's express language of the federal Constitution.
The habeas corpus petitions filed on behalf of most of the detainees include as one of the claims the claim that they have been subjected to cruel and unusual punishment in violation of the Eighth Amendment. So that claim is in the petitions. Now, the reality of life at Guantanamo is that since 2003, there has been little or no torture. The first men who were brought there were not treated terribly well. And what my client Adil experienced in Bagram was something that people experienced in Guantanamo in the beginning. The last 3 years, that has not been happening. The inhumane treatment is really centered around the hopelessness, the lack of rules, the lack of process, the lack of contact with the outside world. To be sure, the way in which the men are treated is not consistent with the Correctional Association guidelines that govern what happens in a U.S. prison, whether federal or state. But the clients who are getting along, going along with the program, it's okay. If you don't go along, it's god-awful, and it is horribly abusive. But people are not being overtly tortured. It's now the psychology of despair. That's the torture.
John Leeper, City Club member. Thank you very much for a most informative presentation. You, in a way, have obliquely answered a part of my question, which is, in light of the last two bits of legislation concerning these personnel, I just wonder what your perspective is on anything in the way of federal legislation that could be proposed to correct and better clarify some of these issues, and would you be kind enough to address possibly what should be in that legislation?
Sure. The Military Commissions Act that was passed this past fall had several components to it. One established rules for trying people in Guantanamo who are actually charged. And there have been 10 men charged with violations of the laws of war in Guantanamo, charged for committing overt terrorist acts, shooting at a U.S. soldier, blowing up a Humvee with an IED, etc. The MCA procedures came pretty close to mirroring the procedures in the Military Code of Justice. And they're okay. I mean, I would not be jumping up and down and ranting and railing about those procedures in total. Some of the things still need to be made a little fairer. But overall, for people who were charged, an effort was made. The problem is that only 10 of the roughly 400 men still left there have been charged with anything. And it's the 390 who are in limbo with no process who are the subject of my representation and what I'm talking about. For those men, what can we do? Well, as I mentioned, Senator Dodd has introduced a bill to repeal the habeas corpus repeal. And I think that that is absolutely critical. And beyond that, I really don't think there is a great deal to offer. You know, when people say, got to shut down Guantanamo, my reaction is, no, that's not the issue. The problem isn't having a prison where we keep terrorists who we have tried in some system, military or not, as terrorists. There's some bad guys in Guantanamo, and they should be locked up. The problem is depriving them of process.
Kurt Wavering, member. I was going to ask about federal legislation also. So let me ask us another kind of how we change this. Would there be any efficacy in going to a body like the United Nations and getting an international protocol about the handling of such persons?
Yeah, the Center for Constitutional Rights is not only representing individual people who are imprisoned in Guantanamo, they have also been very active on the international scene. They have been working with the UN, they have been working with Amnesty International, they have been doing whatever organizations of that nature can do on the world stage to try to get world opinion involved. And in our own little way here from Oregon, we have put out, available to the public, a summary video of our investigation as a court exhibit, and it's available on our website. One of my investigators was so incensed by his experience there that he created a shorter video that's available on YouTube. And that YouTube video has led to articles about our clients and the work of the Federal Defender for the District of Oregon in Le Monde, en Paris, in New Zealand, in Peoria, in Miami. A person protested in Miami, appeared on the Miami Herald front page, dressed up in an orange jumpsuit and chains, and she had Adel Hamad 940, as the number. And I say, these younger people, because this guy, I didn't even know YouTube existed, understand something about the synergy of the internet that I didn't have a clue about. Absolutely incredible. So the world is aware of Adel Hamad, as is Amnesty International.
Ron Cease, a member of the City Club. As I understand it, a number of prisoners have been released. Can you give us a sense of what kinds of distinctions are made between those that are kept and those that have been let go?
I can tell you what my clients have told me, and that is that it is another aspect of the absurdity of the situation. I go down there and I talk to Hamad, or I talk to Basarda, or I talk to some of my other clients, and they say, yeah, last week 16 Saudis went home. And I know that 3 of those Saudis are really nice, wonderful, innocent guys just like me. But I also know that 3 of those Saudis are pretty nasty al-Qaeda terrorists. So I cannot divine any rationality to the release. And from speaking with other habeas lawyers who have represented blocks of Kuwaitis or blocks of Saudis, as has been the case, they say the exact same thing. The government has let some people go. They have let some people go who are innocent, and they've probably let some people go who maybe weren't. Thanks again. Thanks for your time.
On behalf of the City Club of Portland, I'd like to thank you all for being here today and participating. I'd like to thank our radio and television audience for your interest in City Club. And I'd like to ask you to join me again in thanking Steve Wax for his passion and hard work. Hope to see you next week, and we are adjourned.